Holistic Healing, and I am so honoured today to have my beautiful teacher, Jane Hardwicke Collings, on the call, and we're going to speak about beautiful women's mysteries, a bit of her story and blood magic. So if you don't know Jane, she's a grandmother and a former midwife for around 30 years, I believe, home birth midwife. She's a teacher, writer and menstrual educator. She gives workshops all around Australia and internationally on mother and daughter preparation for menstruation and the spiritual practice of menstruation and shamanic pregnancy. She is currently in the Southern Highlands in New South Wales, but yeah, just travels all around to share her beautiful wisdom. And yeah, we've been trying to organise this call for quite some time and it's finally aligned. And so yeah, thank you so much for jumping on with me today, Jane.
Thank you, Holliea. It's an honour. Thank you for inviting me.
Beautiful. So yeah, we've got I have my own experience to share at some stage of a download I received about Herstory and the rise of the patriarchy and how our menstrual cycle kind of comes in from that. But yeah, I just thought I'd hand it over to you to kind of share her story. You've got a beautiful book called Herstory that you can purchase from your website. And I remember reading that for the first time and just the feeling, the shock in my body was, you know, this is something that I'd never contemplated or aware of, how we're taught this masculine side of history, how, you know, there's all this conquering and control, and there's actually a really feminine foundation that was, you know, past 5,000 years ago, I believe. The goddess and the feminine archetype was actually the dominance. I don't even know, I like the word dominance, but, you know, we're living more in harmony with the moon and the earth, and then the masculine kind of rose up and conquered, and it turned into this control and structure. And you can really see that playing out now through 2020 and all the craziness that's going on. There's kind of this big shift that's happening, right? The feminine's starting to rise. People are waking up, becoming more conscious and connected with the land, and the masculine structures are starting to break away. The truths are coming through. We're starting to finally realize how controlled and manipulated we've been for such a long period of time. But yeah, Jane, I'd love you to share her story and yeah, the foundations of the feminine principle.
Okay, thanks, Holliea. So I wrote the Herstory a long time ago when I was first preparing my workshops on sharing the sacred feminine and reclaiming feminine wisdom. I'm just looking here at the date. So 2004, I wrote the first version of it. And I wrote it as an introduction so that women could, who were coming to the workshops, this was a workshops particularly about the wisdom of the cycles and the spiritual practice of menstruation. Both sentences that women would often think, wisdom of the cycles, what's that? And spiritual practice of menstruation, what do you mean? You know, so even just those words were enough to show the individual what they did or didn't know. And so many people have heard much of the content in this little booklet that I wrote about the rise of the patriarchy and stories of colonization and conquer and war and the witch hunts and the rise of the church and all of that. But reading it all together in one document has, like you said, a rather shocking effect on us. And primarily I wrote it because I think that it helps us understand where we are now by remembering or learning where we've come from, which is the classic thing. You know, if you want to understand where you are and what's going on and where you're headed, step one is learn or remember or find out about where you've come from.
Yeah.
And the other little saying is that if we don't remember our history, we are condemned to repeat it. So humans have this problem. Humans have lots of problems, but one of them is that we rarely learn from our mistakes. And that's particularly seen across generations too.
Yes.
So that's why everything just keeps repeating, because people don't learn from the mistake of it, and they just accept it as the way of things and just participate in it in that way. So I wrote this her story as opposed to his story, as you said, because his history, I think that's one of the biggest things that people go, oh, history, his story.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
But also history has always been written by the victors, the people who win. And it's the story that supports their whatever they did.
Yes.
And the stories of the oppressed rarely are told from their perspective, obviously, because they don't have the ability to even do that. This is changing now because of the internet and social media, and we get to hear everybody's everything.
Yes.
But the thing about the her story, understanding where we come from so we can understand what we're dealing with and where we're headed. And I think that the first experience that most of us in a modern Western world, the first time we even get an inkling of this is, and I watched this happen with my children. I don't actually remember it as a child myself, but my most recent experience was Jackson, who's now nearly 30, when he came home from school in maybe, I think it might have been year 4th or 5th class, with an assignment. And the assignment was find out when women got the vote. And, you know, it sounds like oh, what a great question. But I said to him, like, how about the question, why the fuck didn't they have it in the first place?
Yes.
You know, like I doubt many people even think about that, you know?
Yeah.
Why didn't women have the vote in the first place? Like, that's the main question.
Yeah.
What actually happened when did whatever happen such that women were only receiving the vote in recent history? So, you know, vote as in citizenship and entitlement of the entitlements of citizenship. So we're living in this culture, and a culture is a co-creation, right? It's not anybody's fault. There's nobody to blame here. Like, the situation that we're in now is something that didn't happen yesterday. It's been building for thousands and thousands of years, and we can make sense of it with some grand cycles and looking at the way things go and all of that kind of stuff. But understanding the roots of where we are now is actually going to expose the causes for what is now. And we know so very well from, well, I don't know if everybody knows, but the idea that in our body, for example, if we have some sort of a problem or an illness or a you know, imbalance, that we can band-aid the situation, we can deal with what's on the surface, but that'll only cover it up. It won't
suppress it.
Yeah, and it won't cure it. It might look like it has, like, but actually the cause, like what is at the root of it, hasn't even been dealt with. So we know that with our bodies. So if you you know, like well, I think one of the classic ways that happens is the rampant use of the oral contraceptive pill for teenage acne. Like, you know, that's not going to actually do anything.
Exactly. Or menstrual conditions like endometriosis and PCOS, that's kind of seems like that's the only kind of, you know, surgery or the pill seems to be the only option they're giving, and it really frustrates the hell out of me. And I guess that's why, you know, we step up and do this work to share the alternatives, and it needs to happen. And
and alternatives kind of makes it sound like something
even
other,
alternatives.
but, you know, like, so basically all due respect to modern medicine, we've learned a lot through the reductionist perspective that they've analyzed the mechanistic view of our body. However, it's not the whole story. And, that's kind of obvious to a lot of people, but a lot of people still remain under the spell of all of that, thinking that that's all you have to do. And so that's why people don't get better. So because the root cause isn't dealt with, not even acknowledged. So, of our cultural ills, so to speak, I think that predominantly the root cause is this rejection, oppression, suppression, and ultimate rejection of the feminine, which actually looked like women in the beginning, and then the earth, and then feminine knowledge, wisdom, and power. So we've all suffered, for want of a better word, from this experience, and there's lots to it that I'll get into. But one of the Herstory focuses on the negative treatment of women and children and the earth. But the fact is that the only cultures that have survived to now through the patriarchy are the cultures that have sacrificed their men. So it's not like men got off scot-free or anything like that. This is not about men and women. It's about masculine and feminine, yin and yang. I think sometimes when we say yin and yang, people get it a bit more because everybody's got a masculine and a feminine aspect. And so oppressing the feminine doesn't just affect women, it affects that aspect of men. And, we've all grown up with those crazy things like boys are not supposed to cry or whatever. So that's what that looks like in a kind of suppressing the feminine, which is the feminine would be about, and I don't mean women. Feminine is more about the inward journey, the inner experience, the feelings, and the dark. And dark doesn't mean bad. It just as opposed to light, which doesn't mean good.
Exactly.
So all of this stuff, but the only cultures that survived also sacrificed their men. So sacrificed their men to war, like and also sacrificed men's dreams. So men in over the thousands of years have predominantly not been able to pursue their own personal dreams. They've had to be part of the
structure.
Structure and pursuing the dream, which would be for them to be the effective provider and protector of their family unit or their cult or their village or whatever. So they had to conform to a certain way of being a man, which was stifling in and of itself. So I've just mentioned that because I think it's really
something really, I've never contemplated at all, of course, but it is this, there needs to be masculine and feminine in balance, and there's become this imbalance, like, the masculine energy's been risen, and I guess that's where the men are coming in. They're wanting to be on this masculine energy risen with the structure and the providing and fitting into this model, which has compromised their feminine side. So it's wounded masculine energy and wounded feminine energy. So it's not in balance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For everybody.
Yes.
Without them even knowing.
Yes.
Yeah. So and we are experiencing the effects of it because it's the cultural norm, like so cultures are function around a certain mindset. So people believe the same things and they fear the same things. So everybody's kind of on this kind of journey together to maintain some sort of status quo, ultimately to protect everybody and look after everybody. I mean, in a good way. So cultures happen around all sorts of things, like it's you can have a culture at your high school, you can have a culture at your office, you have a culture in your women's circle, we have a culture at the School of Shamanic Womancraft. So it's the framework that everybody agrees to, basically. And like in its most extreme, we have the word cult, which is just short for culture, so it's just a more
Yeah.
localized version of a culture, possibly
Yes.
smaller. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's really good to kind of just realize that that's the way we operate, and that humans are herd animals.
We want to fit in because it's dangerous to not fit in, right?
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
need to belong. And
Yes.
if we feel like we don't belong, then we are hardwired to do whatever we have to do to belong, because as you say, if we don't belong, then our life is at threat.
Traditionally we would have been kicked out of the tribe and then lost in the wilderness all alone, and
And probably died.
Yes.
Or was eaten or whatever. So we do whatever we have to do to fit in, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's also a positive way to look at that would be to just think about codes of behavior, like that we have certain agreements that you fit in if you behave in a certain way, and if you don't behave in a certain way, you don't fit in. And like, that's good when everybody's got the same ideals, but when they don't, then that's when it gets all really, really messy. So I feel like where we are right now, and as we're speaking, there's bloody terrible stuff going on everywhere around the world. And we have this bloody privilege here for sitting here on Zoom having a chat about, well, where have we come from? But, like, I just want to honor that, how blessed we are to have this conversation and send out love and care to everybody who's suffering in the mess that we've co-created right now. And I just, my heart goes out to everybody who's really struggling in every aspect of their life for the place we now find ourselves in. And as a midwife, I feel very passionate about how this stuff, our culture, affects birthing, because I know that birthing is such, mothering and pregnancy, birthing and mothering is all about creating the future. And the way we don't care for our mamatotos, our pregnant mothers, birthing mothers and mothers of babies, will and already has shown up in our culture, like with ritualized, institutionalized rituals of separating mothers and babies, over the generations. This is what it looks like when those people grow up. They don't have a connection to the mother, which ends up being the earth, actually, ultimately. So we reaping what we're sown. So
yes, and that disempowerment comes down to that hierarchy again, isn't it? Where we're handing our power over, expecting someone higher up is going to save us and support us, rather than empowering the woman to connect with her own inner power. And that plays out in everything in life.
Yeah. And all this gets reinforced. The patriarchal mindset gets reinforced in lots of ways, but particularly at our rites of passage. So for women, the women's rites of passage it's often called the women's mysteries, or the blood mysteries, or the blood rites. And these are times in our lives of great transformation, when we change from one version of ourselves to the next version, never to return to the previous. And these would be being born, our menarche, our first period, and then our pregnancies, and then and births, because every pregnancy results in a birth, even if it's an early pregnancy loss or a miscarriage, as it shouldn't be called, and or an abortion, that's still a birth, and then menopause and death. So it's at these rites of passage where this inculcation and recreation and empowering of the culture happens. And it's also a clue for us that that's the place for positive intervention as well, at our rites of passage. So we can change the culture at the place where the culture is created, which is at rites of passage. So that's all about what Shamanic Womancraft, that's what Shamanic Womancraft is all about, using rites of passage and the spiritual practice of menstruation to basically change the doomed trajectory that individuals and the culture are on. And I know I've gone completely off the Herstory already, but
it's all a part of it, though. It's
exactly
foundational, and it all together.
So I just got some bits of paper here just to remind me about the Herstory.
Great.
And I'll just say that there's some misunderstandings or misconceptions about where we've come from. And, you know, like the idea is that it wasn't from a place where women were the bosses to a place where men were the bosses. What preceded the patriarchy was like an agricultural or a hunter-gatherer sort of scenario where people were working together, like
Harmony.
Yeah.
The balance of the masculine and the feminine.
However, the cultures were matricentric, which meant they were revolved around the mothers and the babies. What a genius idea. You know, to think about that being the focus means you're thinking about the impact of the experience of being gestated in the womb, being born and being nurtured by the mother until you're, you know, whenever you're old enough to look after yourself. That experience of every individual, and then the experience of the mother doing that, that is what creates the future. That's what creates the individual who will be the future, etc. So, like, surely, it seems so obvious to me that the important people to look after all the time, I mean, everybody, but mothers and babies, because that's the future. That's the future, you know. And like, if we're headed where we're headed, if we don't think about this and change stuff, is just into places where mothers mothering is encouraged to be outsourced now, you know, like the capitalist culture wants women back at work ASAP, so that they're earning more money so they can spend more money, and everybody can get a second fridge or whatever, you know, like so it's, the system works because it supports the system, but it doesn't work for the individuals. Anyway, so back to what happened. We were living in this matricentric situation where mothers and babies were important. It then devolved with the Indo-European tribes from Northern Europe and Central Asia descending into Western Europe, the Near East and India. And they rode horses and fought with bronze weapons. So that was all new to the others, to the pagans that they came to conquer. Now, pagan just means peasant. It's nothing cooler or anything more brutal or interesting than that. Pagan means peasant.
Right.
And peasants were in connection with the earth and the cycles of the earth. So that's where we got the term pagan, as being somebody who would do that. So these people, these men, came and basically used a war tactic that is currently still used when conquering lands, and that is to to kill the men, rape the women, and pillage the land. And raping the women sounds like, you know, a bit gross, but the point of that was to make the babies that would come to be theirs.
Yes.
You know, so totally disrupt their whole situation, as well as, you know, hurt and terrify the women.
Yep.
So that's what happened. And women were enslaved and exploited and exiled. And then the religions started to develop, and the patriarchal religious authorities changed everything, the way that everything was working, into a male-dominated thing. And part of their mission was to overturn the pagan or peasant systems of matrilineal inheritance, because land at that point was passed down from mother to mother to mother, or mother to daughter, I mean, to daughter to daughter. And so they switched that to father to son, and they actually went through a process of, by forcible seizure and warfare, the church managed to acquire a third of the properties on the continent of Europe by the Middle Ages. So, you know, they were taking the land away from the people. Like, you know, this isn't something unusual. It has continued to this day in some way or other. But then the way the church built huge cathedrals on top of goddess shrines, and they changed the stories from the divine feminine to the divine masculine, and the divine feminine was left out. And women became the property of their fathers or husbands.
Yes.
And all their rights were taken from them, and they were deprived of citizenship. So that's the beginnings of why didn't women have the vote? Because they weren't even classified as a citizen. And like, you know, for people of color and indigenous people and black people, this continued for millennia. And you know, it's recent history in our land here in Australia that indigenous people have been even granted personhood. Like it's
the 1960s or something. I think I saw recently. I was just like,
terrible.
oh, my mum was alive then. That's crazy. Crazy. So it's so good to hear all that. Not great, but you know, you can see the foundations, and you can also tap into these are ancestral wounds. This transition period is inside of us, our ancestors and our past lives, and that's a huge part of healing, is acknowledging it and feeling it, and then seeing how it's playing out now, and also noticing the shift that's happening. And you know, everything goes through cycles. There's no good and bad. It all has to happen for a reason. So it's good to have that understanding as well. But there's definitely a shift happening now, you know, when you think back to suppression.
Absolutely. And, you know, not a moment too soon as well, because what we're seeing is like the way, like this, it's written on the wall, the signs are everywhere. All we actually need to do is look at the statistics for women's health. You know, they're terrible. So what I mean by that is like looking at menstrual pathology, because the menstrual cycle is was another one of the things that was denied. Actually, you know, it was women sorry, blah blah blah. One of the ways we experience this Herstory, the patriarchal story of the oppression of the feminine, is in our bodies, actually. And when religion, all the main current patriarchal religions began, they all of them, in the key texts of all the major faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism, all hold that menstrual blood and women who menstruate are unclean, impure, and responsible for everything from failing crops to contaminating meat. So that's the other thing that's at the basis of our beliefs.
Our blood shame.
Blood shame. So menstrual, this is called the menstrual taboo. And it's pan-cultural, meaning that it's in every culture, everywhere, and in some places it's like heaps worse than others. And it is being addressed, you know, like in our modern Western world, people are talking about periods now more than ever, you know, like, and the ads for pads are getting more interesting, instead of like pretending that you just plug yourself up and wear tight white clothes and go horse riding when you're bleeding, which is like ridiculous. No one wants to do that. But it's only in the last year or so that the advertisements for menstrual pads, that they've changed from using blue liquid to red liquid. So, you know, it's so
small things.
Yeah, the messages in there are, you know, dodgy. And
the
brainwashing. Anyway, so the menstrual taboo is everywhere and has been for as long as we can, you know, as we know. And this is menstrual taboo causes menstrual shame. And for most Western women, well, not Western, for most people who are in the cultures that hold the menstrual taboo, which I said is almost all of them, the initiation of menstruation at menarche, our first period, turns into being an initiation into menstrual shame.
Yes.
And we already know, because people have studied all of this, that menstrual shame leads to body shame. And body shame, because if you reject your menstrual cycle, which is what's encouraged, then you reject your body. And if you reject your body, you're rejecting yourself. If you reject yourself, then that equals where we are now, like lost souls. So menstrual
Exactly.
shame leads to body shame, and body shame leads to low self-esteem, and low self-esteem leads to all manner of wounded behavior, including eating disorders, self-harm, and isolating behaviors, and anxiety and depression. And for teenagers, sad, unfortunate, dangerous and risky sexual decision making. So, and that, you hear stories of what's going on in high schools with boys and girls and what the currency is, head jobs in the toilet, lineups, it's fucked. So I think, and I'm not alone in thinking, that a lot of our problems, particularly around ourselves, has its roots in menstrual shame. So menstrual shame affects how you give birth.
Yes.
And also because one rite of passage leads to the next. So how we are initiated into womanhood at menarche, our first period, impacts how we give birth, because how we give birth is related to how we feel about our body. And if we're rejecting our body or turning it off, which is what the pill does and any other hormonal contraception, then we land in birth at birth with zero to minor connection to our body, very little experience with learning from our menstrual cycle how to understand how our body talks to us through experiences or symptoms or whatever. And so intervention rates increase and have increased and continue to increase year after year as we see the effects over and over. And then again in menopause, like menopause, instead of being the rite of passage into the wise woman years of our lives, is seen from a medical perspective as a hormonal disorder, or what is it called? Imbalance. I mean, and that it's a disease process. It's not a disease process. So here we see, which is a result of the Herstory, that anything to do with the feminine that is powerful,
Yes,
or anything that to do with the feminine that's put down or invisibilized or discouraged or made fun of or turned into a taboo or a negative thing is a clue that it holds power.
exactly.
So all you need to do is look at the fear around birth and the fear around menopause as a clue, and also the amount of control that we're encouraged to take over our menstrual cycle. Why do you need to have a menstrual cycle? Like, duh.
Because it's the most powerful detoxification process and such a powerful process. We need to have it. But yes, I hate saying masculine suppression, but hearing what you've just shared, you can see now you're putting the clues together of why. And all these cultures, like in Indonesia, I spend a lot of time in Indonesia, and seeing the signs that women aren't allowed in the temples while they're bleeding, and the belief is because they're dirty and they should be at home and no one wants to touch them or be around them while they're bleeding. But the truth is, before this, suppression and these stories came out to suppress the women and her power, it's actually that the woman is so powerful during her bleed. If you walk into a temple, crazy things could happen. So there's this earth energy and this heaven energy that can connect. But there's also an Indian culture, Indian tradition that's still practiced today, where in some parts of India or some tradition where the woman has her own room in the house, and as soon as she's bleeding, she's in that room, she's meditating, the man or the grandmother looks after the family and cooks and cleans, and the woman has that time to have her own space, and it's sort of projected as she's dirty and unclean and needs to be separated from the family. But the truth is she needs separation from the family and that time to herself, so she can connect to her own truth, connect to her prophecy, and rest and rejuvenate herself, so that she can give to her family for the rest of the month with a full cup. And
exactly.
That our blood and that time of the month is actually such a powerful time, and it's just dissed as dirty and unimportant and a burden.
Yeah, and that mostly comes from the information that was learned by the male anthropologists that went into these traditional cultures where there were these isolation rituals around menstruation, that they didn't talk to the women about it. Women wouldn't talk to them about it, but they saw this and they perceived this as another example of the impurity and dirtiness of the woman and the separation from her from the family to protect everybody. But actually, like you've just been saying, what you just described is what we would now call a red tent or a moon lodge, and it's chosen a retreat space during the time for our bleeding, which, when you understand the menstrual cycle and the impact of and the abilities and the superpowers and the importance of honoring each phase of the menstrual cycle, that then makes a heap more sense and becomes everybody's responsibility. So the other thing I wanted to mention too is the origins of medicine, because that gives us a whole lot of clues to why what's happening now is happening.
It does.
And so basically the medical profession developed, like it didn't exist before, around the 13th century in Europe. So what it did exist before were the healers. So there were healers in each village. The midwives were often the healers as well. And then there were the herbalists and the wise women and the wise men who worked with the energies of whatever they worked with, you know, the cycles and herbs and plants and practices to help people with their healing. So that was already working and happening. And then with the patriarchy and the church taking power, the medical profession began around the 13th century as a result of contact with the Arab world around that time. And so there was a revival of learning in Europe around that time. And that's when medical schools started and in universities, and universities were closed to women. Like women couldn't go. So the only people who began the medical profession were men, and they were rich men because they were the only ones who could do it. And so you can imagine the agendas there. And so the way the system worked was that part of their development was getting rid of all the female healers because they were taking their clientele and wiping them out. So that was the witch hunt and stuff. And then denying women access to education for medicine. So, and the doctors, the medical professionals had to work with the church, and they couldn't do anything without the church's approval. And like, it was very weird and twisted. And the way they viewed everything was that the male body was the normal and the female body was the abnormal. And so anything that the female body did was seen as just an imitation of the male body, and then a lot of it was left out, like, because it was, you know, the menstrual cycle was just dirty. So
you can still see that now, even there's so much in the medical system, but even with yoga, a lot of yoga traditions, you know, again, that's been shared through the male body and a practice for a man. And it's only now that there's women sort of stepping up and changing things through yoga to be suitable for women and for their cycles. You know, we're not meant to be doing Ashtanga yoga all month long. That's what men can do, not women. So
exactly, you know, so we're getting to realize that, like, a duh. But you know, that was kind of just what was happening in the background that people didn't even realize. And it's only been since about the 1990s that they've even begun testing drugs on women. You know, they didn't even test drugs on women because there were too many variables. They're too unpredictable. So testing a drug on them, even if the drug was for women, was only ever tested on men. So that's another very interesting piece of the history. So
then I see women that are get hormone tests from their doctors, and just get a certain part of their cycle tested. Like, no, you need the variables of the cycle because your hormones are going up and down. So even, on that level, it's still
there's so
still
much
happening now.
misunderstanding. So much misunderstanding. Like hardly any women understand the menstrual cycle.
Yes.
Have any idea about it.
Yes.
And that just gets perpetuated everywhere. And then that plays out in birth. Like, a lot of women go into having a baby without any idea about how it works. And then that's so much the case with menopause.
Yes.
So we've been kept in the dark. And, even it's only recent that the actual anatomy of the clitoris has been revealed, and something that a huge majority of women experience. I probably got the stat right here. Between 2 and 22% of women in our population experience endometriosis.
Wow.
And they're only just starting to investigate it.
And think I've read your stats before as well. It's somewhere around 30%, somewhere between 20 and 30% of young women, when they first get their period, their menarche, think something's terribly wrong with them, that they're dying and they're not actually sure what's happening. I'm sure that's changing now, but I know that was definitely the case for me. And that brings in that blood shame of thinking there's something wrong with your body and trying to hide it and feeling embarrassed, and how that plays out through your whole life and then comes back up when you're giving birth, unless you've healed it, become aware of it.
Exactly.
Which that might lead me, and I might just share a bit of my blood shame story and a bit of a download that came up for me recently. I had a bit of blood shame triggered with my husband, and that kind of brought up this, masculine, feminine wounds, and relating and working through that. And I think it was day 1 of my bleed. I was feeling super clear and open and vulnerable, and I really sat with the blood shame and contemplated the history and her story, thinking back to, the suppression of the 5,000 years and just this deep feeling that, no, this blood is powerful. I feel like it was used as medicine. And through the patriarchal suppression and the masculine suppressing the feminine power, that it's been made to seem dirty. I went in and I was Googling, and I just got one of the documents up where I've copied and pasted all these things. One thing I just wanted to read out, that one key point that I found, I was looking at all different cultures, and it's quite hard to find this information, but it just says, in some historic cultures, a menstruating woman was considered sacred and powerful, with increased psychic abilities and strong enough to heal the sick. According to the Cherokee, menstrual blood was a source of feminine strength and had the power to destroy enemies. So that's just one little snippet, but I've got a few there. I might put it all together and make a document at some stage. But that also then led me on to contemplating how traditionally I feel this download that I received. I was shaking and crying, and I actually sent Jane a voice message and then said, oh, this is too much, I need to process this. I just had to reach out to you about it. But I've had some time, maybe about 6 months, to kind of sit with it a bit more. But I believe my truth is, through this download, that all women would have been menstruating at the same time in the whole world, with a bit of a variation, and how powerful that would have been. You can kind of think back to having rituals and all the women gathering and doing blood rituals and a certain, under the new moon. And then once they've finished bleeding, coming back into the tribe and sharing their prophecies and their dreams and feeling really nourished and nurtured from that inward time. And then rising up together with the full moon, and then having rituals and ceremonies around the full moon and giving thanks for our harvests, and having ceremonies and being up dancing around the fire and having that connection with our whole tribe. So it's like this masculine and feminine integration that would happen around the full moon. So I don't know if I've had like past life flashbacks or something around that. It feels really real in my cells. And I also felt like with what we're going through now, how powerful it would be if all women just could magically start menstruating on the new moon. But there's also, you don't want to control things, but to have that intent would be amazing. But there's also, that leads on to lunar asynchrony, which we can talk about in another chat, what it means to menstruate on different moon phases. And obviously we menstruate on the moon phase we're meant to menstruate on, because it has a certain power and different medicine for us. And I don't usually schedule calls like this while I'm menstruating. I do it when I'm ovulating, which is usually around the full moon, but my cycles come a week early this cycle, which is really, really strange for me. So yeah, I'm actually on day 3 at the moment as we're speaking, which, you know, it's kind of hard. It's more of an inward time. It's hard to articulate words and to show up in this way, but it's perfect. It is what it is. But yeah, I just wanted to share that there's still some way I want to share this wisdom, and it really links in with what you've just shared, and seeing the history, the Herstory, and then understanding how we feel and how we see our cycle. And also society just wants us to look like and feel like we're ovulating all month, right? I remember when you said that initially, that's why we're reaching for coffee and chocolates and things to perk us back up. Because we're not honoring that inward energy. Yeah, there's so much. There's so much. I could really, really speak about this, and I know you speak about it for your work. It's your life, and I could speak to you all day and all night about so many things. But is there anything, Jane, you wanted to share with what can we do to heal? What awareness can we bring? What's some kind of practical tools or levels of awareness? I know you've got your beautiful School of Shamanic Womancraft, and there's so many beautiful blog posts, and your newsletter is such a beautiful thing to connect with. But yeah, is there any practical tools that you would like to share?
Yeah. So I think that it's really important to heal menstrual shame. So first of all, we need to acknowledge it and find where it is for us, or how it is, or what it is, because it can't not be there. It will be there. Like, even if you think that you're totally a menstrually free person, you live in a culture that holds menstrual shame. So it's in the air, in the water, so to speak. So you can't avoid it. So to actually be with it, to acknowledge it, and to notice where and how it shows up in your life, in your relationships. Like you just shared a classic example, you know, like it may not be that you personally hold menstrual shame, or you think you don't, because you will, but that it's in relationship where it comes up. And that could be relationship at work too, you know, like we're finally getting to a place where we're even starting to think about menstrual workplace policies and menopause workplace policies. They're total bloody genius. But, you know, the main opponents of that are women who feel like it's a terrible threat to introduce the menstrual cycle into a sort of arena, for want of a better word, where we've been fighting for equality, and don't, whatever you do, talk about our weakness, in inverted commas, of the menstrual cycle. So that's still holding the menstrual shame. So I would suggest that everybody does the personal inward inquiry required to reveal all the places where menstrual shame lurks in your life, in the way you lead your life, in the way you bleed, in the way you don't, or etc., or talk about it, or how you are with your children. That's a really important thing.
Yes, of course,
Like
children. Yes.
You know, for those of you with little children, and I'm talking about the little children who won't leave you alone, because at some point they will not want to be following you everywhere, and they will stop asking you why. And you know, it's sad when that stops, and it's important to be with it whilst it's happening, because it's happening for a very, very big reason. The children are doing this process called imprinting, which means they're learning from their main people, and that would be their mother and father, and whoever else is in a, you know, up power relationship with them, so teachers and authority figures. So in terms of the menstrual cycle, children, boy and girl children, are learning about the menstrual cycle by watching what their mothers do. And it's not what they say, it's what they do. And so we have this opportunity, especially with boys, for about, I don't know, how long does it, it'll be different for everybody, but at some point the boys will stop following you to the toilet. They will stop asking you everything, and they will start to move away from you. And that's part of it. And girls too, obviously, but we've got this window of time in our little boys' lives to menstruate openly and honestly, so that they learn that it's a thing, you know, like it actually exists. And you just tell them whatever you need to tell them, you know, like mummy's not having a baby now, so mummy's having her blood, or whatever.
Her
And they
inward
won't,
time, and mummy needs some
yeah,
space, and
I need to sit down, have a rest. Like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go running today or whatever, because you're teaching them, preparing them for being in relationship with women. So that's really important. So for mums of little kids to do that around that, because I think if we all as a culture worked on eradicating menstrual shame, then everything would be different. So that would be my suggestion. Do the personal work and the work within your relationships to acknowledge menstrual shame, and then what's the word? Banish it. Shed and banish menstrual shame. And I've made a little e-course called Snake Medicine.
Oh, beautiful.
Shedding menstrual shame for this very process.
Right. Perfect. Yeah, I've done a post about healing menstrual shame, and it was around how I share my experience with my daughter, and you know, if she sees I'm on the toilet and sees a bit of blood, she says, "Oh, your moon time's here," and she goes off and gets me a pad, and she really is involved in that process. And quite often she puts toilet paper down her knickers and says, "Oh, my moon time, I've got my moon time too." And we've spoken about, she can go and get her ears pierced when she gets her moon time, and blah blah blah. And you know, it's something that she's looking forward to at the age of, I think it started at the age of 2, but just really nice to have her involved in that. And of course for a little boy, how beautiful to have him involved in that.
So that's part of doing what we have to do, which is to co-create a positive menstrual culture. Because we currently have a negative menstrual culture.
Yes. And I have to be honest, I still have a bit of blood shame, because there's so many times I've, you know, done ceremonies with giving my blood back to the earth and videoed it, and just haven't posted it on Instagram, because I think about, you know, my brothers or my old schoolmates that might see it. Or, you know, I like to put a bit of blood on my third eye on the 3rd day of my bleed when I go to sleep, and I've taken photos of that as well and never posted it. So that's something I'm working towards. It's going to be, look out Instagram. I'm going to start sharing a bit more blood magic on there. But it's the many layers of healing, of course. Oh, Jane, I love you. I miss you. I can't wait to see you in person sometime soon. And I'm so honored to have jumped onto this chat with you. It just feels like such a deep passion of mine, and of course yours. It's your life work. You're so dedicated to healing the wounded feminine and sharing the menstrual magic with the world. And I've got so much honor and respect for you and love for you. So thank you so much. And let's jump on another call at some stage, and we'll talk a little bit more about a lunar asynchrony, which kind of leads into all of this. What we've just shared is such a great foundation. And we can talk a little bit more about rituals and what we can do. And I'd love to share a bit more about menopause at some stage as well. You've gone through that transition, and I know you've got some wisdom, a lot of wisdom to share about that. So thank you. I love you. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Many blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.